Today's episode is brought to you by Media for All, which was set up to help encourage more Black, Asian, and other ethnic talent into media, and to provide a support and mentoring network to ensure talent flourishes in the media industry that we all love. If you're looking for a mentor or would like to mentor young ethnic talent, check them out at mediaforall.org.uk, and it is all 100% free. Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this is a weekly podcast about the future of marketing. Every episode, I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing one of our industry's leaders, and this week is no different. I'm on a call with Gerardo Mazzeo, who is Global Innovation Director at Nestlé. So, Gerardo, can you give the audience an overview of who you are and what you do?
Sure. And firstly, thanks very much, Tom, for inviting me. A real pleasure to be with you. So, my name is Gerardo Mazzeo. I'm currently the Global Innovation Director at Nestlé. I've spent just over 23 years with the company. So, a bit of a lifer. My current role is really all about focusing on sort of three buckets. Bucket number one is really about our front end innovation practice. So helping our marketeers across the world really understand what are the opportunities, what are the size of the prizes in those opportunity areas, how do we articulate those opportunity areas, through ideation into concepts and prototypes, and then hopefully test them with consumers. The second bucket is I lead and manage Henry, our global open innovation platform. And thirdly, I'm also responsible for our digital acceleration team, which is a leadership program which focuses on accelerating the digital transformation and the capability building of our marketeers across the world. And I started my career at Kraft Foods way back in '92 in Cheltenham, and I worked on brands like Maxwell House, Kenco, and a great local brand called Mr. Brain's Faggots. And I would say that Kraft was like going to the University of Marketing. It gave me the most amazing fundamental frameworks about marketing and how you truly excel in the function of marketing, and that was a great beginning for me post university.
And so when did the innovation bug kicked in?
That's a very good question, because I think I sort of fell into innovation, or the current role that I'm doing, more by default rather than by design. At Nestle, every sort of 3 to 5 years, the organization moves you on either to a new geographical role or a new type of leadership role within your current market. And I was at the time leading our food, confectionery, and dairy business in the Nordics, based out of Copenhagen. And I was called back by the head of our corporate marketing department to lead the innovation area within what we define as brand building the Nestle way. So it's not that I'd never done innovation before, because as a marketeer, that's one of your sort of custodial roles that you do at Nestle. But to be focused on it, 100% of your time, to design all of the practices, the principles, and then lead that in terms of training workshops and capability building workshops with business units around the world, really happened through that call, as they were looking for how do we develop the next stage of your career within Nestle. And it's just coming up to nearly 8 years now that I've been in that particular role, and over that time, the breadth and the scope of my role from that original discussion has really evolved. And I think that's the beauty of working within an organization like Nestle, that they're constantly pushing the limits of both your career development and functional expertise in various areas as well. And I truly have enjoyed, the last 8 years in doing this role, because it gives you tremendous exposure to the challenges at the front line that our markets and marketeers face. You get an amazing global overview of the different competitive landscapes in our different categories, and you start to understand, the local ecosystem of, innovation, startups, entrepreneurialism, which feed really nicely into the work that I do with Henry on our open innovation platform.
So I want to give the audience a little background and insight into how you do all those things. So what new belief or behavior has changed your work life in the last few years?
Um, I think there's been a huge sort of increase in the level of experimentation and the culture of sort of looking outside to solve, internal business or innovation challenges. That's not to say that the organization didn't look outside in terms of partnerships or collaborations, either with bodies of academia or other, sort of open innovation practices. But I think within what we would call sort of the commercial or the generating demand unit, that was less of a practice. So for me, the fact that, we were able to present to the executive board way back in 2015, present the proposal for Henry, our open innovation platform, and start to use that as a vehicle to connect our internal our internal sort of business units with their specific business challenges to different startups around the world, and in solving those challenges in, basically the best part of 100 days, has been, a huge step change in how we, look at innovation, how we approach this particular area, and how we bring, different and adjacent insights into that particular area as well. So that for me has been, one of the biggest changes that I've seen in my specific role over the last, 3 to 5 years. And, I've been privileged, because I use that word because it really has been, an amazing journey so far in meeting so many young, talented startups and what they're doing, and also what they're doing to disrupt, the rules of the game in many categories that organizations like ourselves play in.
So talking about young talent and so on, what would you advise a student who is wanting to follow in your footsteps? I mean, there can't be that many bigger innovation jobs in marketing out there. So what would you advise someone who is new to the industry, that really wants to make a splash, who is already doing the basics of looking after themselves and reading and learning and so on? What are the tips that you would give that new cohort of people coming into the industry?
Again, another great question, Tom. I think you have to have passion, and you really you have to love what you do. And now I know that may seem a little bit basic, but I've always, I've been a food marketeer for the best part now of what, 27, 28 odd years. And I've always had, a passion for food. I think if I hadn't come into, the corporate world and working for an organization like Nestle, one of the things that I wanted to do when I was much younger was to be a chef. I mean, growing up in an Italian household, I can still remember very vividly standing on a little crate next to my mum in the kitchen and learning how to make fresh pasta, the sauce, all of the different sort of culinary sort of things that they bought when they immigrated to the UK in the late 60s. These were the things that I was surrounded about. And growing up, even though I was, on an English street, it felt like a sort of a mini Italy where we lived. There were many other Italian households. So growing up with food, and food being at the center of of our household, at least, that really generated a huge passion in things like, where does my food come from? How is it made? What are the ingredients that go into it and stuff? And I think, that's always stayed with me. So, and I think I see it when I meet these young startups, the passion that they sort of exude for the particular business proposition that they have to build, develop, sell. That's what stands them out against, other startups who may just be as skilled as they are, but there is a difference in the energy that they bring and stuff. And I think now competition and the war on talent, has really, really intensified. So all of the things that you described, Tom, about reading up about the industry, going to events and conferences, speaking to those individuals that come from the market. I mean, that's really, really important, because you really need to go, a step further than everybody else. And I'm a firm believer that if you truly love what you do, you're just gonna go that extra distance, because then it doesn't feel like work. And what I was saying to you earlier, 60-70% of my time, before COVID, was spent traveling. And many times your weekends would be screwed, they would be compromised because you're having to get from one part of the world to another. But it didn't feel like work, because at the other end, either there was a great innovation workshop that you're about to lead, or you were going to a great event like CES or South by Southwest, or Mobile Web Summit, all of those things that you really looked forward to going to those things. And I think that would be, for me, one of the most important pieces of advice that I would give, because I'm sure there is some form of, if you could do a formula, that success is definitely correlated with the passion that you have for something that you do.
So it's interesting you list off all of those events that we're probably not going to go to next year, and maybe sort of slightly teary-eyed at how brilliant that would be to go to one of those things. But you're talking about, Henry, you're talking about all these different conferences, you're talking about multiple teams flying all over the place, innovation sessions, a huge responsibility at Nestlé. You must be overwhelmed, not just on a kind of stress and intensity level, but overwhelmed with the amount of opportunity. Like, even for you to memorize all of the marketing technology pigeonholes would be a big bit of work, let alone remember who the key players are, and let alone understand them from a delivery and point of difference perspective. So how do you deal with that overwhelm of information in such a way that you can effectively pass on the right opportunities to the business?
Yeah, great question again, Tom. When I first started going to the events, some of the events and conferences that I just described, there is this tendency to meet as many startups as possible. And you'd always get, in the event app, people would set up, meetings or coffee sessions with you. And to be honest with you, I would more often than not say yes, because you never know what type of door might be opened with these conversations. I soon found out, though, that it was like a tsunami of all these notes that you had, booklets that they gave you, leaflets. So then I started to become much more tailored in my approach. And so instead of a sort of a shotgun approach, I was very much thinking, okay, when I go to these events, I need to have some form of framework on what are the areas that my business colleagues back in HQ are really interested in. So then I would be more tailored in who I would say yes to and who I would say no to, because there is a responsibility that you have when you go to these events, that when you come back and you summarize your experience and who you've met, that it needs to add value in the discussions that you have with those business function leaders or category leads that we have, so that hopefully you may be able to make that connection. So what I started to do is I would ask each of the startups or innovators that I would meet that I felt may have something. I'd ask them to provide just a one pager on what the business proposition was, why they were unique, why they were differentiated, and why they would be relevant for category XYZ within Nestle. And it's amazing how quickly you would filter out those that were really serious with opening up a discussion with you and the business leaders, and those that that didn't. And so that really helped me in cutting down the number of sort of emails that I would receive, also the number of decks that were 30, 40, 50 pages long, which simply no one has the time these days to read. And I certainly wouldn't be forwarding those on to our business category leads, because they would say, well, for God's sake, Gerardo, at least provide me with an executive summary of some bullet points. Don't just send that material on. So the one pager, at least for me, is a really, really good tool, because it's easy to digest. The people that I then connect with, and I just ask very simple questions: the uniqueness, the differentiation, and the relevancy. And then, the bottom, what their contact details are. And if we decide to carry on that conversation, we've all got it in one page. And if that seduces the recipient of that particular one pager, then I know that I've hit at least the right startup to open up a conversation with. Because you're right, everyone, we're very fortunate that when someone says, oh, we have Gerardo Mazzeo from Nestle presenting on this, normally after the discussion or the panel or the presentation, there's always a nice lineup of people who are really keen to talk to you and to find out more about how innovation or the work that I do in Nestle happens, how they could, what are the learnings for them, and for some young startups or students, some of the questions that you've asked, how can they connect, how can they meet and discuss somebody with their particular business proposal, and so forth. But if you've got a queue of 10 people waiting to speak to you, it also means that it reduces the amount of time that you have to then visit the rest of the convention or the event to find out more for yourself, so that you do bring added value back to the organization. So this openness, this flexibility has to be tempered with, I need to have some form of framework so that when I go back, I am adding value, because we're very, very fortunate that the company allows us and pays for us to attend these events. So you do have to bring back something of value. And again, many, many years ago when I started out, I would try to attend as many of these events as possible. Now, just like with everything else in life, you become much more selective in, the ones that are truly going to add value to those conversations, and the ones that, through past experience, haven't really delivered against the sort of the headlines or the content that they were trying to sell to you before you arrived as well. And I think also over the last 5 years, these events have really upped their game as well. They've really got amazing speakers, they've got great startups. The venue is much more conducive to an event of discovery. They sometimes categorize the different startups into different verticals, so that one area is fintech, one area is clean tech, one area is marketing tech. So exactly where you're going to spend your time. Because in the good old days, I remember you'd wander around and there would be somebody who was a fintech person sitting next to somebody who was in food tech, and you were very much on a safari trying to find out who is it exactly that I need to find. But now, the really clever event organizers have made life so much easier for individuals like myself who attend these events.
This episode of the Shiny New Object podcast is brought to you in partnership with Madfest. Whether it's live in London or streamed online to the global marketing community, you can always expect a distinctive and daring blend of fast-paced content, startup innovation pitches, and unconventional entertainment from Madfest events. You'll find me causing trouble on stage, recording live versions of this podcast, and sharing a beer with the nicest and most influential people in marketing. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com. So we're at the halfway stage now, and your shiny new object is leadership and coaching at the time of COVID. So I think that sounds quite obvious what that is, but can you let the audience understand why you've chosen that and what that means to you?
Sure. If you recall at the beginning of the conversation, Tom, one of my scope of work buckets was our digital acceleration team. Now, this is a leadership program where we recruit the best of the best young talent from all over the globe in Nestlé. And we invite anywhere between 16 to 18 of these top talents to come to spend 10 months in Vevey in our headquarters. And in that 10-month mission, they will be exposed to an in-depth training of different functional areas, but the majority of their time they're spending on projects for stakeholders where we've already selected about 35 to 40 different projects, which could be around e-business, it could be around digital capability building, it might be about helping a particular business team or unit launch a brand into the digital world, or how do you launch it digitally in a way to really drive impact. And then at the end of their 10-month mission, they return back to their home markets, either to lead a digital function or to be promoted into, either an e-business lead or e-stream lead or whatever. And right now they're 2 weeks away from that, from their final time here, and then they all head back to where they are. So you imagine, my team of 17 arrive in January, full of expectation and hope. The program is incredibly well organized. Some of them would be, visiting events and conferences like I described to sharpen their sort of innovation skills and their different exposures to startups. So there's a very intensive program laid out for them. In February, as we start to, sort of get wind of what is happening in China, we start to think about what the impact might be. And then literally before we've even had the ability to sort of execute one of our sort of plan Bs, the world sort of goes into lockdown. So 40% of my team went back to their home markets to either be with husbands, families, or loved ones. The remaining 60% stayed in Vevey, but obviously not at the office, not in the digital acceleration room, which we built many years ago when we launched it in 2012. So they were in their apartments, isolated from the rest of the team. And there was I, to begin with, was commuting between Switzerland and my home in the UK. And then obviously, the UK went into lockdown on March the 23rd, and I was home. So what I turned to, and I was putting myself in the shoes of those individuals that were away from their homes. Many of them had left just after, New Year. Some had arrived on January 2nd, January 3rd. And it was highly unlikely that they would be able to return home. So how do you, coach, motivate, and inspire these young talents who have been given, a number of different projects to work on with their stakeholders, and to ensure that the deliverables of those projects met their deadlines when there was no physical contact? You're not working in teams, you're stuck in an apartment in a foreign country. And obviously we're working on all different, time zones as well. I think I had 3 of my team in the US, I had 2 in the UK, 2 in the one in the Czech Republic, one went back to Ukraine, and one went back to Turkey. So, you're having to navigate all of this and ensure that you are delivering the best leadership and coaching practice to keep that momentum, going on. So, one of the books that I think one of your questions is about, are you a reader of marketing books and which ones do you recommend? I'm, over time, I'm not really an avid reader of these marketing books, but there is one section of those books that I refer to, and they're the ones that are predominantly on leadership and coaching. Things like, good to great, why should I be led by you? And there's a few chapters that I always go to, and it's all about, how do you actively listen to their concerns? How do you still apply all of those leadership principles when you're doing it remotely? Yes, we can see each other on FaceTime, Zoom, or whatever it might be, but that's not the same as sitting next to someone or even having a coffee with them and reading their body signals. As we just mentioned, you can quite easily hide your hands. You can even disguise some facial features, because it's difficult unless you're very, very good. It's difficult for that intuitiveness to be picked up when you're doing it and stuff. So it was a learning experience to me, in the sense of I was truly humbled by the continued initiative and focus that these guys showed in maintaining a very high degree of professionalism, really keeping focused on the projects with their stakeholders. Because remember, also their stakeholders were also working remotely in different parts of the world, because the projects can come from not only our strategic business units and our zone teams here in the HQ, but they can also come from different markets within the Nestlé world as well. So, that's another added layer where, you're having to also, manage how other your stakeholders might be feeling, whether that's anxiety, whether, the isolation and the quarantine is also really impacting them. So it was really about, making sure that you listen to all of their concerns, you try to alleviate any of those that they might have. And I would say I spent the majority of my time when I was engaging with all of the team, literally just in a mode of active listening, and trying to make sure that, we continue to inspire and motivate them, whether that was by, I'd be getting feedback from the stakeholders, reassuring them that everything was on track. And if we had any obstacles, what was the best way to overcome those obstacles as well. But I think it was all about being present and being someone that they could turn to, to lean on as well. And that, for me, I think, especially in the last, 6 months, has probably been one of the most demanding aspects of my sort of coaching skill set and career today, because none of us have ever experienced this as well. And when you think about, this in previous DAT cohorts, at weekends they would be traveling, Europe together. You think some of them have never ever been to Europe, but some of them have never even left their home market as well. So it's a huge deal. The selection and application process is incredibly demanding, and that's by design, because we truly want the best of the best. And I think it demonstrated to me that, that process that we went through to find, the really, really good talent paid back, because, it showed their characters, their strength, their willpower, and their resilience. Because, at one stage, we didn't know whether we should bring the program to a halt and say, look, it's just becoming too difficult to exercise and to truly extract all of the value. But the feedback from the stakeholders basically proved that irrespective of where they are, work was being done and great work was being done. So that has been, for me, my shiny new object. And personally, I've learned so much about how you do it remotely. What are the different tricks and tips that you use? That's why I said, I go back to some of the, probably maybe a couple of books, and there are certain chapters about, what are some of the techniques that you can use. I mean, obviously they didn't write the book with, in the middle of a pandemic like we have now, but the fundamental principles are all there. The active listening, letting them sort of express and get out all of that angst, and then trying to sort of solve it with them, not for them, but with them and stuff. And many of them right now, we've got one girl who is due to go back to Colombia. She's on a standby humanitarian flight because Colombia still has its international borders closed. So with our HR business partners, we're figuring out what are the best options for her to get back to her family who she hasn't seen since the beginning of the year. So it's a really, really big deal. And I think for me, the importance of leadership and coaching in such events overshadowed everything else, because I know if I'd been, a 25-year-old first time out of, especially like a country either from the Far East or South America, and you were stuck in an apartment in a foreign country where you didn't speak the language. I mean, Switzerland isn't known for its, e-business execution, or its home delivery only really happened in the last few years as well. We're not talking about the same structure that you have in the UK. So all of these things just went to compound the anxiety that they were feeling as well. So that for me was, when I reflect back on 2020, it was a personal highlight for me because I learned so much from the experience of this.
So Gerardo, really frustratingly, we have to finish there. So if someone wants to reach out to you about either pitching their business or learning more about leadership and coaching during this time and moving forwards, other than sending you a killer one slide, how would you like them to get in touch with you?
I mean, LinkedIn is by far the best platform for me.
Brilliant. Gerardo, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the Shiny New Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That would just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.